September 21, 1943. A forest clearing 3 kilometers north of Minsk, Belarus. Oberleutnant Franz Hartmann stood in morning mist watching 37 civilians dig their own graves while his hands trembled inside leather gloves he could not stop clenching. 23 years old. 18 months on the Eastern Front. This was his first execution detail. The civilians worked in silence. Elderly men with spades. Women with their hands. Children watching their parents dig. The sound of metal striking frozen earth carried through birch trees turned gold by early autumn. No one spoke. The condemned had learned that silence sometimes bought minutes. Minutes were all they had left. Hartmann had received the orders at dawn. Partisan activity in the region required reprisal action. The civilians were accused of providing food to Soviet irregulars operating in the forests. Village elders denied the charges. German intelligence reports indicated otherwise. The district command decided the village would serve as an example. Hartmann's commanding officer, Hauptmann Wilhelm Stein, had delivered the orders with the same tone used for routine supply requisitions. 37 executions. Documentation required. Bodies to be disposed of in existing anti-tank ditches. Report completion by 1600 hours. The paperwork was already prepared. Only the signatures were missing. Hartmann had served under Stein since June 1942. Stein was methodical, efficient, indifferent to the human cost of military objectives. In 18 months, Hartmann had watched Stein order artillery strikes on villages suspected of harboring partisans, approve scorched earth tactics during retreats, and sign deportation orders for forced labor details. Stein viewed Eastern Front operations through purely tactical frameworks. Enemy combatants, enemy supporters, enemy territory. The civilian population was an obstacle to be managed or removed. This morning, Stein had added a final instruction before dismissing Hartmann. Execute the children first. Make the parents watch. Psychological deterrent against future collaboration. Hartmann had saluted, turned, walked to his quarters, and vomited into a metal wash basin. Now he stood in a forest clearing trying to remember why he had joined the Wehrmacht in 1940. The propaganda had promised restoration of German dignity. Liberation from Versailles constraints. Protection of European civilization against Bolshevism. The recruiting posters showed clean uniforms and clear purposes. They did not show this. 20 soldiers from Hartmann's platoon formed the firing squad. They had been selected because they were experienced. They had participated in executions before. They knew the procedures. Hartmann had examined their faces during the march to the clearing. No emotion. No hesitation. They would follow orders. They always followed orders. The graves were nearly complete. The civilians stepped back from the trench. Some looked at the soldiers. Others stared at the ground. A few held hands. One woman was praying quietly, orthodox ritual movements, small gestures of faith in a godless moment. Sergeant Klaus Weber approached Hartmann and reported the preparations were complete. Weber was 38, a peacetime policeman from Hamburg. He had served in Poland, France, and now Russia. He executed orders with the same professional competence he had once directed toward traffic violations. Weber showed no more concern about shooting civilians than he had about issuing parking citations. Orders were orders. Duty was duty. Hartmann acknowledged the report. His voice was steady. His training held. An officer maintained composure regardless of circumstances. An officer did not question superior commands. An officer served the Reich and the Führer without hesitation or doubt. But Hartmann's hands would not stop trembling. He walked toward the edge of the graves. The civilians arranged themselves along the trench as instructed. Adults on the left. Children on the right. The children were between 4 and 14 years old. 7 of them. They held on to their parents' clothing or stood alone looking confused. The youngest, a girl with blonde hair, watched Hartmann approach with eyes that reminded him of his sister. Hartmann's sister was 9 years old in Heidelberg. Safe. Protected. German. These children were not. They were enemy children. Partisan children. Children who would grow into partisan adults if allowed to live. That was the logic. That was the rationale. That was what officers were supposed to believe. Hartmann gave the command to ready weapons. 20 rifles raised. 20 bolts clicked. The children flinched at the sound. Some parents pulled children close. Others turned them away from the guns. The pregnant woman placed her hands on her abdomen and closed her eyes. The regulation called for firing squad commanders to deliver commands in 3 stages. Ready. Aim. Fire. Each stage separated by 3 seconds. The procedure ensured synchronized volleys. Maximum efficiency. Minimum suffering. Hartmann's mouth opened to deliver the second command. The word stopped in his throat. He saw the children's faces. He saw his sister's face. He saw the future. These children dead. Their parents dead. The village destroyed. The orders completed. The documentation filed. The war continuing. More children. More executions. More graves. And nothing changed. Germany would not win the war because 37 civilians died in a forest clearing. The partisan threat would not decrease. Soviet resistance would not weaken. These deaths would accomplish nothing except creating more hatred, more resistance, more partisan attacks that would justify more reprisals in an endless cycle of violence that served no military purpose. Hartmann understood in that moment that he was not protecting Germany. He was not defending European civilization. He was not following necessary military protocol. He was murdering children to satisfy bureaucratic requirements and demonstrate German brutality. He lowered his pistol. Waffen runter. Weapons down. The firing squad hesitated. Sergeant Weber stared at Hartmann. Sir. Lower your weapons. That is an order. 20 rifles slowly lowered. The civilians remained motionless, uncertain whether this was mercy or new cruelty. Hartmann walked toward the children. He stopped 5 meters from the trench. You are released. Take your families. Leave this area. Do not return to your village. No one moved. They did not believe him. Hartmann repeated the order in broken Russian. Still no one moved. They had learned that German promises were worthless. Better to die quickly than to be hunted through forests. One woman finally stepped out of the trench. She pulled her daughter with her. Others followed. Slowly. Watching the soldiers. Expecting bullets in their backs. Hartmann gestured toward the forest path. They began walking. Faster. Then running. Within 2 minutes, the clearing was empty except for Hartmann's platoon. Sergeant Weber approached. His face was carefully neutral. Sir, the orders. I will report that partisan activity prevented completion of the operation. Enemy forces engaged our unit. We were forced to withdraw. Sir, Hauptmann Stein will require confirmation. Then he can visit the clearing himself. I will not execute children to demonstrate German authority. Weber said nothing. The other soldiers watched Hartmann. Some showed relief. Others showed concern. Refusing orders carried consequences. Refusing execution orders carried death sentences. Hartmann had just ended his military career and possibly his life. But he could breathe again. His hands had stopped trembling. For the first time in 18 months, he felt like something other than a machine processing human beings into corpses. The march back to the command post took 40 minutes. Hartmann walked at the front of his platoon through birch forests and abandoned farmland. His soldiers followed in silence. No one spoke. No one asked questions. They understood they had participated in refusing a direct order. They understood the consequences. Sergeant Weber walked beside Hartmann. After 20 minutes, Weber spoke quietly. My son is 7 years old. In Stuttgart. When I saw those children. He stopped. Did not finish. Hartmann nodded. Weber had seen his son's face in that clearing. Hartmann had seen his sister's face. Perhaps many of the soldiers had seen children they knew and the faces of children they had been ordered to kill. The command post occupied a requisitioned manor-house 4 kilometers from Minsk. Hauptmann Stein maintained his headquarters in the former estate owner's study, surrounded by maps and operational reports. Hartmann entered the building knowing he would not leave as an officer. He found Stein reviewing logistics documents. Stein looked up when Hartmann entered. Report. The operation was abandoned due to partisan activity in the sector. Stein set down his pen. Explain. Soviet irregulars engaged our unit during preparations. We withdrew to avoid casualties. How many partisans? Estimated 20 to 30 combatants. Small arms and automatic weapons. Did you return fire? Negative. Tactical situation required immediate withdrawal. Stein studied Hartmann's face. You are lying. Hartmann said nothing. Stein stood, walked to the window overlooking the courtyard. His back to Hartmann. You refused the orders. Yes. Why? The executions serve no military purpose. They would have increased partisan activity in the region rather than suppressing it. Stein turned. His expression was not angry. It was disappointed. You believe you are more qualified than the district command to determine military necessity? I believe executing children is murder, not military operations. You believe incorrectly. This is the Eastern Front, Oberleutnant. This is total war. The enemy does not distinguish between soldiers and civilians. Neither can we. Every Soviet citizen is a potential partisan, a potential saboteur, a potential threat. We eliminate threats before they materialize. Then we create new threats with every execution. We create obedience. We establish dominance. We demonstrate that resistance is futile. These are proven psychological tactics, Hartmann. Your sentimentality is a luxury this army cannot afford. Hartmann remained at attention. I will accept whatever punishment the Hauptmann deems appropriate. Stein walked to his desk, opened a drawer, removed a pistol. For a moment, Hartmann thought Stein would shoot him. Instead, Stein placed the weapon on the desk between them. You have two options. Return to the clearing. Complete the executions. Or I will file charges of refusing orders in combat, cowardice in the face of the enemy, and undermining military discipline. You will face court-martial. The sentence will be death. I will not return to the clearing. Stein picked up the pistol. Chambered around. Set it back down. You are a fool, Hartmann. You threw away your career, your honor, and your life for 37 Soviet civilians who would kill you without hesitation if our positions were reversed. They are not human beings. They are obstacles to victory. Resources to be eliminated or exploited. You should have learned this by now. Perhaps I learned something else. What? That following orders does not absolve us of what we do. Stein's face hardened. Guards. 2 military policemen entered. Stein gestured to Hartmann. Place this officer under arrest. Charges: refusing direct orders, abandonment of duty, and conduct unbecoming an officer. Confine him to the holding cells pending court-martial proceedings. The policeman moved toward Hartmann. He removed his pistol belt, handed it to the nearest guard, and allowed himself to be escorted from the room. Stein watched him leave, then returned to his logistics reports. Another problem solved. Another form completed. The holding cells occupied the manor-house basement. Converted wine cellars. Stone walls. Iron bars. Cold. Damp. Hartmann's cell measured 3 meters by 2 meters. A wooden bench. A bucket. Nothing else. He sat on the bench and tried to understand what he had done. He had sacrificed everything, career, freedom, life, for people he had never met and would never see again. People who were enemies of Germany. People who would celebrate German defeats and contribute to German destruction if given opportunity. People he had been trained to view as subhuman obstacles to Reich objectives. But they were children. They were parents. They were human beings facing death for the crime of existing in a war zone while belonging to the wrong nation. And Hartmann had discovered he could not murder them to satisfy bureaucratic procedures and military protocols that served no purpose except demonstrating German brutality. The question was whether his refusal mattered. 37 people lived because he refused orders. But thousands died every day on the Eastern Front. Millions had already died. His single act of conscience changed nothing strategically, accomplished nothing militarily, protected no one except those 37 civilians who would likely die anyway when the war swept through their region again. Yet it mattered to him. He could not unsee those children's faces. Could not unknow that following orders would have required murdering them. Could not pretend that duty and obedience justified every action regardless of moral content. The door at the end of the corridor opened. Sergeant Weber entered, carrying a metal tray. Food. Bread and soup. Weber slid the tray through the bars, then stood looking at Hartmann. Half the platoon wants to testify on your behalf at the court-martial. The other half is scared they'll be charged as accomplices. They should be scared. Stein will use anyone he can to reinforce discipline. Some of us were relieved when you gave the order to lower weapons. We didn't want to shoot those children. But we would have. Because that's what soldiers do. Is it? I don't know anymore. Weber turned to leave, then stopped. My grandfather fought in the Great War. He told me about orders he refused. Not big orders. Small ones. Told a sergeant to requisition supplies differently because the original method would have starved French civilians. Sergeant reported him. He spent 3 months in a military prison. Lost his rank. But he said it was worth it because he could live with what he did. What happened to him? He died at Verdun 6 months later. Stepped on a mine during a night patrol. But he died believing he was human, not just a uniform. I think that mattered to him. Weber left. Hartmann ate the bread and soup. The food was flavorless. He barely noticed. The court-martial convened 3 days later in the manor-house drawing room converted into a military tribunal. 3 judges. All officers senior to Hartmann. All experienced Eastern Front commanders. All believers in total war doctrine. All committed to maintaining discipline through any means necessary. Hauptmann Stein testified first. He presented the original orders, described Hartmann's refusal, detailed the violation of military regulations. His testimony was professional, factual, devastating. He made no personal attacks on Hartmann. He simply demonstrated that Hartmann had refused a lawful order during combat operations and attempted to justify his refusal through prohibited moral reasoning that undermined military authority. Sergeant Weber testified next. He confirmed Stein's account but added context. Described the civilians' ages. Mentioned the children. Noted that some soldiers in the platoon had been relieved when Hartmann refused the execution. Weber's testimony was careful, balanced, insufficient to change the outcome but enough to establish that Hartmann had not acted from cowardice but from conscience. Hartmann testified last. He did not deny refusing orders. Did not claim partisan activity had prevented completion. He stated plainly that he had released the civilians because executing them served no military purpose and violated his understanding of honorable conduct. He acknowledged that his refusal constituted insubordination and accepted responsibility for his actions. The tribunal deliberated for 17 minutes. The verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all charges. The sentence was death by firing squad. Execution scheduled for dawn the following morning. Hartmann returned to his cell. He had expected this outcome. Refusing orders during wartime carried only one penalty. The Third Reich did not tolerate conscience as justification for disobedience. Soldiers who placed personal morality above military necessity were traitors to the state, obstacles to victory, examples to be eliminated. He lay on the wooden bench and stared at the ceiling. 23 years old. He would be executed at dawn. In Heidelberg, his parents would receive notification that their son had been executed for cowardice and refusal of orders. They would believe he had failed. His father, a professor of classical literature, would not understand how his son could abandon duty. His mother would mourn a coward's death. His sister would grow up knowing her brother had been shot by his own army for failing to follow orders. But they would never know what those orders had been. They would never know he had been ordered to execute children. They would never know he had chosen death rather than murder innocents. The official record would show only cowardice and betrayal. At midnight, footsteps echoed in the corridor. The cell door opened. Sergeant Weber stood with 2 soldiers. "We're moving you to a different location." Hartmann sat up. "Where? Does it matter?" You're scheduled for execution in 6 hours. Then why move me? Weber said nothing. The two soldiers entered, lifted Hartmann by his arms, led him up the stairs and through the darkened manor house to the rear courtyard. A truck waited with engine running. They pushed Hartmann into the cargo bay, climbed in after him, and the truck departed. They drove for 40 minutes through dark countryside. No one spoke. No one explained. Hartmann sat on the truck bed wondering if this was some new form of execution. Perhaps they would shoot him in the forest and leave his body for animals. Perhaps Stein had decided a formal firing squad was too much honor for a coward. The truck stopped. Weber opened the rear gate. Get out. Hartmann climbed down. They were at a crossroads in the middle of forest. No buildings. No lights. Just empty road and birch trees. Weber gestured into the darkness. Start walking south. Don't stop. Don't come back. If German patrols catch you, they'll shoot you immediately. If Soviet patrols catch you, they'll probably shoot you as a German spy. Your best option is to find partisan groups, surrender, and hope they believe your story. What story? That you refuse to execute civilians. That you deserted rather than continue serving the Reich. That you're willing to provide intelligence about German positions if they'll let you live. Maybe they'll believe you. Maybe they'll shoot you anyway. But you'll have a chance. Why are you doing this? Weber looked at Hartmann. Because my son is 7 years old. Because when I return to Stuttgart after this war, I want to be able to look at him without seeing the children we killed. Because you gave us a chance to refuse orders, and now I'm giving you a chance to survive that refusal. Don't waste it. Weber and the two soldiers climbed back into the truck. They drove away. Hartmann stood alone in the darkness listening to the engine fade into silence. He began walking south through the forest. Hartmann walked for 8 days through occupied Soviet territory. He avoided roads, traveled at night, scavenged food from abandoned farms. He removed his uniform jacket, buried his identity papers, became a refugee in enemy territory fleeing his own army. On the 9th day, Soviet partisan scouts found him sleeping in a barn 3 kilometers from the front lines. They bound his hands, searched him for weapons, debated killing him. He spoke no Russian. Could not explain. Could not justify his presence. A German soldier behind Soviet lines without uniform or identification was a spy by any reasonable definition. They brought him to their commander, a Red Army officer named Major Volkov who had been cut off during the German advance in 1941 and had been leading irregular operations ever since. Volkov spoke German. He interrogated Hartmann for 6 hours. Hartmann told him everything. The orders. The children. The refusal. The court-martial. The escape. Volkov did not believe him. German officers did not refuse execution orders. German officers did not release condemned civilians. German officers did not desert to save their conscience. This was obviously a German intelligence operation. Send a deserter to infiltrate partisan groups, gather information, report locations. I can prove nothing, Hartmann said finally. I have no documents. No witnesses. Only my word that I refuse to murder children. You can believe me or shoot me. I no longer care which. Volkov studied him. If I send scouts to check your story and find you lied, I will skin you alive and leave you staked in a field for German patrols to find. If your story is true, you will work with us. Provide intelligence. Help us kill Germans. Do you understand? I understand. Volkov sent scouts. They reached the village Hartmann had described. They found the civilians alive, hidden in forest camps, terrified but surviving. They found the graves that had been dug and then abandoned. They found German records of an execution operation that had been postponed due to partisan activity. The scouts returned after 3 days and confirmed Hartmann's account. Volkov changed his evaluation. Not a spy. A deserter. A rare German officer who had discovered conscience in the middle of total war and had chosen principle over survival. For the next 19 months, Hartmann worked with Soviet partisans providing intelligence on German deployments, troop movements, supply routes. He did not participate in combat operations. He was not trusted with weapons. But his knowledge of Wehrmacht procedures and German military planning helped partisan groups disrupt supply lines, ambush patrols, sabotage communications. He lived in forest camps with Soviet civilians and escaped prisoners and former Red Army soldiers who had chosen to fight rather than surrender. He learned Russian. He learned to identify German units by their equipment and radio protocols. He learned to survive on roots and bark and whatever could be stolen from German supply depots. He never forgot the faces of the children he had refused to kill. Never stopped wondering if they had survived the war. Never stopped questioning whether his single act of refusal had mattered in a conflict that killed millions. In April 1945, Soviet forces reached Berlin. The Third Reich collapsed. The war in Europe ended. Volkov's partisan group emerged from the forests and integrated into regular Red Army units. Hartmann surrendered to Soviet authorities and explained his history. They did not shoot him. They placed him in a prisoner of war camp with other captured Germans. He spent 3 years in Soviet detention. He was interrogated repeatedly about his service, his desertion, his collaboration with partisans. Soviet intelligence officers could not understand a German officer who had refused orders and deserted. The concept did not fit their understanding of Wehrmacht discipline and Nazi ideology. In 1948, Hartmann was released and repatriated to West Germany. He returned to Heidelberg. His parents had survived the war. His father had lost his university position for refusing to join the Nazi Party. His mother had worked in a hospital treating wounded soldiers and bombed out civilians. His sister was 16, studying to become a teacher. They did not know what to say to him. He had been reported executed for cowardice in 1943. Now he appeared at their door alive, thinner, older, speaking Russian and German with equal fluency, carrying no possessions except the clothes provided by Soviet authorities. He told them the truth. The orders he had refused. The children he had released. The desertion. The partisan work. Everything. His father listened in silence. When Hartmann finished, his father walked to his study, closed the door, and did not emerge for 3 hours. His mother embraced him. Said only, "You're alive. That's all that matters." His sister asked questions. Wanted to understand. Hartmann answered as honestly as he could. She was old enough to understand that the war had not been glorious. That Germany had committed atrocities. That good people had made terrible choices and terrible people had made worse ones. That her brother had chosen to refuse becoming terrible regardless of consequences. Hartmann found work as a translator. German to Russian, Russian to German. Businesses needed people who could navigate Cold War tensions. His fluency was valuable. His war record was complicated but ultimately acceptable in West Germany's Reconstruction period. Many Germans had refused to discuss what they had done during the war. Hartmann's refusal was different. He had actively refused to participate in atrocities. That made him unusual but not unwelcome. In 1953, he married a woman named Anna who had survived Auschwitz as a child. She understood choices made under impossible circumstances. She understood that survival sometimes required compromise and resistance sometimes required sacrifice. They did not discuss the war often. But when they did, they understood each other in ways that other couples could not. They had 2 children. A son and a daughter. Hartmann taught them history, languages, and the importance of individual conscience over organizational loyalty. He taught them that following orders was not morally sufficient justification for any action. He taught them that sometimes refusing orders was the only honorable choice. He never returned to the forest clearing where he had refused to execute 37 civilians. He never knew if they survived the war. He never received recognition for his refusal. The Wehrmacht officially listed him as executed for cowardice. The Soviet Union classified his partisan work as intelligence collaboration. West Germany had no interest in celebrating officers who had deserted. But in 1967, a letter arrived from Minsk. It was written in Russian by a woman named Katia Voloshyna. She explained that she had been 8 years old in September 1943 when a German officer had released her family from an execution detail. She had survived the war. She had become a teacher. She had married. She had children and grandchildren. She had searched for years to find the officer who had saved her life. She wrote, "I do not know if you remember me. I was the girl with blonde hair standing in the grave watching you while your hands shook. I saw your face change when you looked at us. I saw you decide we were human. I want you to know that because you refused to follow orders, 37 people lived. Their children lived. Their grandchildren live. You changed nothing about the war. But you changed everything for us. Hartmann kept that letter until he died in 1984 at age 64 from heart failure. The letter was found in his desk drawer, folded carefully, read so many times the creases had worn through. Next to the letter was a photograph of 37 people taken in 1975 in Minsk. 3 generations. All alive because one German officer had discovered that conscience could not be surrendered even when the cost was execution. At his funeral, his son read from the letter. Anna spoke about choices made in impossible circumstances. His daughter quoted her father's often repeated principle, "Orders do not absolve us of what we do." The war had produced millions of victims and thousands of perpetrators and a handful of people who refused to become perpetrators regardless of consequences. Hartmann was one of them. Not a hero. Not a saint. Just a soldier who looked at children standing in graves and decided that following orders would require surrendering the last piece of himself worth saving. That refusal cost him everything except his conscience. In the end, conscience was all that remained. And perhaps that was enough. The forest clearing north of Minsk is empty now. The graves that were dug and never filled have disappeared beneath decades of growth. Birch trees rise where children once stood waiting to die. No memorial marks the location. No plaques commemorate what did not happen there. But somewhere in Belarus and Germany and places scattered across the world, people are alive because one man refused to pull the trigger. Sometimes refusing orders is the only order worth following.